cooking that's going on here. And I did just want to reinforce what Anat said. It is a difficult day in Israel. We are mourning the loss of 12 people, 11 people over the last week at the hands of terror attacks. And one thing that I learned as a new citizen of Israel is that life goes on even during very painful times. And I was very honored to be invited to cook for Wizo. I have actually quite a long history with the organization. When my book Sababa came out about 2.5 years ago, I did, I think, my largest cooking event at a private home in Florida at the home of a Wizo member. And not long after that, the National Library of Israel asked me to create a recipe inspired by a book in the library, and I chose the Wizo cookbook. For those of you who don't know, the Wizo cookbook was created for new immigrants to Israel to help them not to Israel, I believe, yes, to Israel, and to help them sort of acclimate to life here and to all of the different nutritional challenges and economic challenges. So I chose a pomegranate beverage that was in the book, and I decided to transform it into a pomegranate tea drink with mint. And I'm going to toast Wizo tonight, and I'm also going to toast the memory of those that we lost. And we're going to move on to our cooking and celebrate the upcoming holiday of Passover with a couple of recipes adapted from my book for the occasion. So cheers to you tonight, and thank you for joining. All right, so tonight we're going to make a very popular dish from the book called the Medjool Date and Root Vegetable Beef Stew. First, everyone, let's preheat our ovens to 450 or 225, 450 Fahrenheit or 225 Celsius. We're going to roast some asparagus a little bit later, and we're also going to get started on our stew. So first, let's take a large pot. If you're cooking along, I'm going to heat it up. And while the pot is heating up, you'll notice that I haven't put any oil in. I like to heat my pot without oil. When you're searing meat, which we're going to do, adding oil at the last minute after the pot is already hot is going to help the meat sear and not stick to the pot. So I'm taking a, hang on one second. I'm taking a plastic bag and I'm resting it inside of a bowl because I'm going to put some things in here, including my meat. I'm taking about 2 tablespoons of potato starch. The recipe in the book calls for cornstarch, but corn is considered kitniot or legumes, so it is not appropriate for some Jews on the Passover holiday. So I'm using an all-approved starch, which is potato starch. And I mentioned this morning in my other session that, you know, as I've cooked through my own book, I've actually made adaptations to my own recipes because I'm always looking to make my recipes as easy as possible. So in the book, I had you salt the meat with salt and pepper in advance, but instead I'm just going to drop in about a teaspoon of salt right into the bag with my potato starch, and I'm going to just grind some pepper. You could do a 1/4 teaspoon or a 1/2 teaspoon or however much you want. Make sure your pot isn't getting too hot, but it is definitely heating up nicely. I can feel. I'm using a nice stainless steel pot. This is an all-clad pot. If you have nonstick, that works well, but I actually find that to brown meat, a really good heavy stainless pan gets a nice darker color on the meat faster than a lot of nonstick pans. If the surface of the pan is a light color, you're actually going to get a sort of a light coating on the meat, which is interesting. All right, so now I'm going to take a pair of tongs and I'm just using this bowl to stabilize the bag. I'm going to add the meat to the bag. And by the way, you guys, if you have any questions, I have someone here with me who can field questions and bring them over. So if you have any cooking questions or any questions in general about Israel or cooking in Israel, I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal story, but please feel free to pass along any questions that you have. I'm using a shoulder cut, which is sort of a long cooking, relatively inexpensive cut of meat. There's no need to use, you know, prime rib here or even short rib meat. You can use something that is relatively inexpensive. I'm just taking the bag and shaking it and making sure to coat the meat completely with this potato starch, salt, and pepper mixture. Now, obviously, you can just use the bowl if you want to. You don't have to waste plastic, which I admittedly have done here. Although I will say that I did repurpose this plastic bag. I tend to wash them out and turn them inside out and dry them out on our balcony here in Tel Aviv, which is right here. All right, you guys, my pot is nice and hot. I'm going to take about 2 to 3 tablespoons of olive oil, and I'm going to drizzle it right into the pot. I keep my olive oil in a dark container with a very small opening. And the reason I do that is because olive oil does not take well to sunlight, and it doesn't take well to exposure to oxygen. That can diminish the quality of the olive oil that you're using. So try and keep it in some kind of a metallic container, or if it's in a glass container, keep it out of the sun. You'll notice sometimes when you buy like a really beautiful Italian olive oil, the oil is actually wrapped in some kind of a gold foil. And the reason for that is because, again, to protect it from the sun. All right, you guys, so now I'm gonna take my meat, which has been coated in this potato starch mixture, and I'm gonna put it right in the pan here. When I put meat into here in a pan like this, I do not move it once I put it in. And because this meat is going into a long cooking stew, I'm not so worried about some of the general culinary rules about not crowding the meat in the pan. I think we're gonna do fine here. I'd rather you not have to cook in batches. So I'm just going to kind of, I wouldn't say cram, but I'm gonna nestle the meat sort of comfortably in the pot. I'm using about a 6 to 8 quart stew pot, and all the meat is in. And we're gonna brown it, the recipe says to brown it for about 2 minutes per side or 8 minutes total, but we'll just kind of see how we're doing. You just wanna make sure that at least 2 sides of the meat have like a really nice brown sear on them. Okay, so I've managed to keep my cutting board meat free, so I don't need to move that or do anything with that. I'm just gonna carry on using it. And now we're gonna sort of shift gears here to our muhammara dip. So muhammara is a beautiful spread or dip that has roots in the Levantine countries that border Israel in the north. We're talking Turkey and Syria, and a lot of people also claim that this dish comes from Armenia. And muhammara is based on roasted peppers, and it typically has walnuts and lemon in it, which are things that are very indigenous to the region where it's being cooked. So one of the goals in my book, Sababa, was to take local recipes and to stay true to them, to acknowledge their roots and provenance, but to put my own Adeena twist on them. So my muhammara dip is gonna have pecans, toasted pecans instead of walnuts, because they have a little bit less of that tannic flavor. And I'm using limes instead of lemons because I love the tartness of limes. But the first thing that we're gonna do is we're going to roast some asparagus. So I just have a small sheet pan here. I have a bunch of asparagus. I snapped off the ends. These are beautiful asparagus that I purchased today in the Carmel market. One of the advantages of living literally 50 meters or less from the Carmel market is that I have access to world-class produce whenever I want it. And I want it all the time. I love cooking vegetable-forward dishes, and Sababa is filled with them. And generally, we don't actually cook a lot of red meat at home. We tend to keep it for holidays and special occasions, which obviously Shabbat and Passover are. So I've drizzled my asparagus with some olive oil, about 2 tablespoons. I'm taking kosher salt. Now, you Americans have unlimited access to diamond kosher salt, which is my favorite. But in Israel, the salt is very salty. It's kind of like a coarse, very coarse salt, kind of similar to a Morton's kosher salt. So people who love me now know that in order to make me happy, they bring me a box of diamond kosher salt when they come visit me in Israel. And it only weighs 3 pounds. Not hinting here, I have a lot right now, but it's a relatively light gift that people really seem to enjoy giving me. All right, so now I have this beautiful coated asparagus. I have my oven that's preheated, and I'm going to throw my asparagus in. It should be time now to flip our meat. So I'm going to check and see if it's nice. Oh, look, it's absolutely beautiful and golden brown here. So I'm gonna rotate all the pieces. I started on kind of a medium flame, and I'm raising it a teeny bit because a lot of moisture is coming out of the meat in order to prevent the meat steaming instead of browning. I'm just raised the heat a tiny bit. It's releasing really beautifully from the pan. And one thing that I always advise is once you put it in the pan, don't move it, don't play with it, don't worry. It's been proven billions of times that meat does what it's supposed to do if you just leave it alone. And when it's ready to be flipped, it will release easily. If it sticks, it probably means that you need, I don't know, maybe another minute or two. All right, so I'm gonna let this brown, and I thought that I might tell you guys just a little bit about my personal story of how I got to Israel and how I became so immersed in the world of Israeli food. So I was nearly born in Israel. My parents were here for a year of my father's postdoctorate fellowship at Hebrew University. They left for Palo Alto, California 2 months before I was born. I was almost a Sabra, which is the term for people who were born in Israel. But I was born in New Haven, Connecticut, but always extremely connected to Israel. I was raised in Israeli census youth groups, and we came here on family vacations. I spent a gap year in Israel between high school and college. And eventually I spent 5 years living in Jerusalem after college working as a TV producer. And it was during that time that I started to realize that Israel was a market-centric culture, not a supermarket-centric culture. This amazing place called Machane Yehuda was available to me. I would just hop on the bus and go pick up produce and meat and cheese and everything I needed for Shabbat. And it really changed the way I cooked. And when I eventually moved back to New York, although I did hit the farmers market, it didn't quite hit the spot the way cooking in Israel did. And it was something that was always in the top of my mind. And I eventually moved back to New York and became a food writer. Around the time that I got into food writing and food media was when Israeli food really started to evolve into its modern iteration that has become popular around the world and an incredible ambassador for this country, a apolitical and a-religious thing that everyone can enjoy and share together. And that is a little bit about my evolution in food. And as my food writing career advanced, Israeli food started to progress as well. What happened was chefs were traveling all over the world. Israel became a wealthier, more developed country. People had disposable income. The internet happened. People started watching food television. People were extremely interested. I'm flipping the meat again. People were extremely interested in different foods from around the world. Israelis are known as intrepid travelers. They were traveling to every country around the world. And a new generation of young people decided that they wanted to become chefs. So they ended up going to work in different countries like France and Spain and Italy at Michelin star restaurants. And, you know, it used to be that the mark of a great chef in Israel was somebody who could reproduce Italian food or French food or Spanish food or continental food, you know, perfectly. And that showed that, you know, we could sort of copy others effectively. But when these chefs went to work in restaurants around the world, they saw that all of a sudden these renowned chefs were taking local ingredients from the French countryside or from the Italian market, and they were just coaxing the flavor out of them and doing a little bit to them and maybe infusing a family story or family recipe into it. And they sort of said, wait a minute, I'm onto something here. I live in a country that has incredible seasonal produce. It has, I'm going to start taking this meat out of the pan. It's gorgeous out of the pot. It's beautifully browned on all sides, and I'm going to put it on this plate here. This is a beautiful ceramic plate from a local ceramicist named Gur Inbar. Israel has a wonderful pottery scene. Israel has an incredible roster of artists of all kinds. I can't believe how creative the people are in this country and just how much high quality cinema, food, art, ceramics, fashion sort of comes, literature comes out of this country. And one of the things I really enjoyed is beefing up my local ceramics collection. All right, I've now taken the meat out and I'm gonna let it rest, and I'm going to add some onions to this pan. So basically, I have one large onion that I've chopped up here. I'm using some red onion and some regular onion. You know, kebab recipes are very flexible and they're meant to be played with and adapted to your own taste and your own convenience. You know, I always say that a recipe is a suggestion, not a hard and fast rule. And I like people to look through my books and just be inspired. If you have shallots, use shallots. If you have leeks, use leeks. If you have a mix, use a mix, and really just feel really free and liberated to do as you need to make the recipe happen. Don't let perfection be the enemy of enjoyment. So I always really like that. I'm also adding some whole garlic cloves here. I often will add garlic cloves whole to a stew or something that's long cooking, because it's going to break apart on its own and it's going to develop that beautiful mellow, almost like garlic confit flavor. So that's what I like to do with garlic here. You could chop it up, obviously. If you have minced garlic ready, you can throw that in as well. And we're just creating some aromatics here, as we like to call them. All right, I'm going to check on my asparagus since it's been into the oven for a little while, and let's have a look at how it's doing. All right, it's starting to bubble a little bit and char a little bit, but I think it needs just a little more time. So I'm actually going to raise my rack in my oven. I have a double oven, but the top oven, the heat really is best when it's from the top. Okay, all right, so I've got some onions here, and I'm just going to give those a stir. So eventually, I started writing a lot about Israeli food and wine. I was writing for Food and Wine and Wall Street Journal and Bon Appetit, and I've been a long-time food columnist for Hadassah magazine. And I really thought about writing an Israeli cookbook, but I kind of felt like a little bit of an interloper because I wasn't living here, although I visited really, really often. So then about 7.5 years ago, I met my now husband, Jay. He was in New York on a business trip, and someone set us up on a blind date, and we fell in love. And within a year, I was living in Israel, and we got married. We're approaching our 5-year anniversary. So I finally found myself living in Tel Aviv, and Jay was smart enough to find an apartment for us that was literally a stone's throw from the Carmel Market, which is also right near the beach, right near Neve Tzedek, which is a beautiful historic neighborhood of the city. The Carmel Market used to be sort of a downtrodden neighborhood and considered southern Tel Aviv, but as the area has developed and people have realized what a gem the Carmel Market is, it's really now more like south central Tel Aviv. The center has kind of moved south a little bit, and it's an area that a lot of people want to live, and it's so fun for me to host people in my home. Everyone comes to the Shuk at least once a week to do shopping or to stop by, so I love that. And our wedding was in Tel Aviv and was very food centric, and people always say, why did you move to Israel? And I say, I moved to Israel for love, but I stayed for the Shuk. And I still think that that's true. I still love you, Jay, if you're watching, but the Shuk is really what kept me here. It's an incredibly multicultural place that plays upon the 100 immigrant groups and local cultures that have influenced Israeli cuisine for hundreds and thousands of years. And you see that interplay and that blend all the time in dishes that combine different sauces and condiments from different cultures. Amba, which is something a lot of us know, sort of a yellow mango chutney, sort of a mango sauce, has roots in an Iraqi Jewish community that moved to India for a time for business purposes and are called the Baghdadi Jews. And when they came back to India and eventually came to Israel, they opened the beef and falafel stands and put this amba on the falafel stations, and people fell in love with it, and now you kind of find it everywhere. And it's just an example of how this food is really just an incredible blend of different cultures. All right, so my onions have been made nice and golden here. They're not charred, they're not dark, but they're softened a little bit. They don't need to be caramelized. Remember, this is a long cooking stew. So I'm going to take about 3 tablespoons of tomato paste, and I'm going to add it here. Tomato paste both add sort of a savory quality that a lot of you know called umami, which is meaty mouth-wateriness. It also adds a gorgeous color, and tomato paste has a high sugar content. So when you caramelize it a little bit and brown it, it lends depth to your dish without it becoming a tomato stew. When you put a can of tomato sauce or crushed tomatoes in something, it ends up being a dominant flavor. And this dish has so many wonderful flavors in it that I want you to taste, including Medjool Dates, which we're going to talk about later, and the meat. And sometimes the tomato kind of overpowers everything. So, all right, my tomato paste is now caramelized. It's been cooking for about a minute or two. And now I'm going to do something that we call deglazing. I'm going to take some wine. This is a little bit controversial. I like to use white wine in my stews as opposed to red wine. I find again that red wine can overpower flavors and sort of become very thick and syrupy, and in combination with tomato products, it can just sort of overpower things. Do you know where that glass measuring cup is? Right, so I was gonna estimate, but I'm trying to be extra careful for you guys. So I'm gonna measure a cup of white wine. I'm using a Hermon white. Hermon is a mountain range in mountain in the north of Israel. Israel has incredible wines. There's many microclimates, which are areas where you can grow wine. You know, we have the Golan Heights, which is very high up and has extremely cold winters and sort of a little bit less sun. And then we have the Galilee, which is really hot, and some of it can be coastal. And then there's the entire Judean Hills region, which is rocky and inland. There are desert wines, there are southern wines, and Israeli wines have won awards all over the world. So I really do like to use Israeli wines both for drinking and for cooking, because I sort of learned this adage in culinary school: what grows together goes together. And we're using this wine, and we like to drink wine that was grown here because it goes well with the ingredients that we're using. Okay, I'm gonna just check on my asparagus. Okay, that looks great. It's got a little bit of blistering and char, but it's still firm and al dente. You know, unlike steaming or boiling asparagus, which can go wrong really, really quickly, I find that roasting the asparagus kind of gives you a little bit more control. You could always pop the broiler on if you wanted to, you know, get a little bit more color or char on the top. It just really sort of depends how you like your asparagus. I take it out before it's completely finished because I'm leaving it on the sheet pan, and that residual heat is going to just kind of continue cooking the asparagus. And, you know, it can go from perfect to a little mushy really quickly. So I'm going to just leave it there. I'm going to add a couple of teaspoons of salt. I'm a generous salter of my food. Obviously, feel free to adapt that to your liking. And now I'm going to add some paprika as well, about a teaspoon. You can do more or less. I love paprika. Paprika adds color without too much of a dominant flavor. It's essentially just roasted, dried, ground sweet red peppers. So, you know, they just take the peppers. You know, one of my favorite stories of a family that I'm close with in the Shuk, the Amrani brothers, the third generation spice business. And one of the reasons that I wrote Sababa is because I felt like it was a privilege to capture these business proprietors, possibly in their last generation. Their grandfather purchased their stall in the Shuk, and it was a spice shop. And every year he would purchase or gather thousands of sweet peppers and dry them in the back of the store on land that they own. And then the family would undertake the grinding process on their own. Today, the paprika is imported from Hungary. There's a little bit of a misconception that all those amazing spices that you see in the Shuk are actually grown in Israel, and not true. There are a lot of things that are imported here. Certain things like za'atar, which is the wonderful biblical spice that's made into a blend with sesame seed and sumac, that in fact is grown here, but a lot of spices are imported. And, you know, Israel doesn't grow enough sesame seeds, for instance, to satisfy its population's desire. Israel is the second highest consumer of sesame seeds in the world after China because of tahina. And therefore, there's an entire brokerage of sesame seed market, people whose sole job is to go to Ethiopia, to Humera, which is the fertile growing region for sesame seeds, and purchase tons and tons of sesame seeds and sell them to halva and tahina makers in Israel. All right, guys, so the wine is practically evaporated. And now it's time to return our meat to the pot. And I wanted to just show you all these beautiful juices that have accumulated here. Please make sure to put those back in with your stew, because that is just pure flavor. Looking so good. I'm going to give you a little, just a close-up look of this beautiful plate. I have a intentionally mismatched set of 12, which I use for entertaining. And now we're going to add some beef broth to the soup. Now, you guys, you could use vegetable stock, you could use water, you could use chicken broth, or a combination. Sometimes I freeze little bits of stock that I have around the house. So I have them at 5 cups. So I'm going to go to 2.5 cups here. Okay. Now, since this recipe takes 2.5 hours to cook, in theory, what you're supposed to do now is throw this in the oven for about an hour and a half, take it out, and then add root vegetables and dates, and then put it back in the oven. But we're going to just let it cook for a while. I'm going to show you how to do that in a minute. We're going to move on to our beautiful mohamara dip, and then we'll come back and finish the stew. And then by the magic wonders of Food Network style television, I have a stew that I made earlier in the day so I can show you what the finished product looks like. Okay, I'm going to show you guys the pot so you can see what is going on here. So we've got it's got a good amount of liquid, but the meat is not swimming in liquid at the moment. But it's going to simmer down covered for about an hour and a half. And now we're going to move on to what has become one of my favorite dips or dishes that I find myself making constantly for entertaining or just to have in the refrigerator. And it is called muhamara. And I've had it typically something that's served either with crudité or pita chips. I love it spread under sort of a schmear underneath a piece of grilled steak or chicken or fish. But I'm trying to show you how versatile this dip is. You know, if you're trying to make side dishes for Passover and you want to just have something can sit at room temperature and not worry about it, like this is perfect. I love asparagus at room temperature. I would not recommend reheating cooked asparagus because you're probably going to lose some of that delicious flavor. All right, and now I have my food processor here. So you could definitely use a blender here, but I find that a food processor sort of helps maintain kind of a chunky, you know, not too smooth. It's hard to control the smoothness when you blend. Once you blend, you're kind of like all in and you're going for something smooth. I like to use a blender for soups or sauces or salad dressings, but when I'm making something like this, I tend to use my food processor. All right, guys, so as we know, many of the best dishes in the world use stale bread because the best food in the world came from poor cultures. Short ribs used to be the cheapest cut. Lobster, not that most of us eat it in this crowd, used to be a throwaway that was given to the sharks and other scavenger fish just as feed because it was basically free. And over time, things change. But bread, stale bread, has remained something that endures in every culture. You've got fattoush salad here, which is a way to use stale pita. If you go to a falafel stand in Israel, you'll see that when they snip off the top of the pita, they'll deep fry those and toss them in sumac or za'atar, and that becomes an incredible snack. You've got papa al pomodoro or ribollita in Italian culture. But because it's for Passover, I decided to use matzah in this dish instead of my usual stale pita. So I'm just going to moisten this matzah a teeny tiny bit with some water. There's no need to sort of like douse it because you don't want to over liquefy the dip. It's a nice thick dip that has just really high quality ingredients in it and you want everything to shine. So I'm just going to let the matzah moisten for a little while. And the base of the dip, as I mentioned, is roasted red peppers. You can make them on your own. There's a recipe in Sababa for fire roasted peppers. You can also buy quality jarred fire roasted peppers, which is a great time saver. I also love a Spanish dip called Romesco sauce, which I am sure if we did some anthropological research is connected to this because Romesco has hazelnuts and almonds and roasted peppers. And, you know, it's kind of similar. And I bet you that it has a Moorish influence that sort of ties into this Levantine cuisine in some way. So I'm going to go ahead and add 3 fire roasted peppers to my blender here. And I'm going to add a clove of garlic. I'm just going to throw it in whole. If you have confit garlic, feel free to use that as well. And then one of my other secrets, as I mentioned before, is using pecans instead of walnuts. And I just find that they have a wonderful buttery flavor. And I think that sometimes walnuts can be kind of tannic and that tea flavor in your mouth. And I just think, why not spoil yourself and your guests if you can use pecans? Of course, use hazelnuts, use almonds, use walnuts, use whatever you have in the freezer. And toasting the nuts for about 10 minutes at 350 degrees really helps bring up and out the flavor. The trick with roasting nuts is once you can smell the nuts are done. So you take them out, let them cool on the counter, and let them cool, because if you sort of roast them, if you put them in hot, it could sort of cook some of the other ingredients, and it can kind of mess with the texture a little bit here. Okay, I'm going to check on my matzah. My matzah's been soaking. So I just thought I would mention, when Wizo asked me to do this cooking class a long time ago, the conflict in Ukraine had not been top of mind, it had not occurred yet. But I was just informed tonight that Wizo is going to be taking in 10 children from the Ukraine in the next 24 hours and putting them in Wizo facilities in Israel, basically saving them. And then they have plans to house about 50 of these children over the coming months. And it's just, one of many, many programs that Wizo is involved in and spearheads in Israel and around the world, really. So, there are chapters all over the place. You can get involved. You can find out what they're doing. They're doing a lot of incredible things in Israel. Americans are not as familiar with Wizo as people in other parts of the world. Very, very strong in South America, Latin America, Australia. But it's starting to become better known in Israel, I think, primarily because of the great work that they do in the United States, excuse me. So, check out Wizo. Okay. Oh, so someone's asking if you can leave the matzah out of the dip. And the answer is absolutely yes. You could add a few more nuts, or you could just leave it out if you want to go gluten-free or carb-free, for sure. I like to add it because I like to sort of stay true to the original recipe. I've squeezed out some water here and I'm dropping my matzah in, but there is no need to put the matzah in. I just sort of like these kind of Passover hacks. I think it's kind of fun. All right, guys, this is pomegranate molasses. I'm using a jarred pomegranate molasses. In the Tikva market, which is in the deep south of Tel Aviv, there's a wonderful man who every year gets tons and tons of pomegranates and reduces the juice into a wonderful, gorgeous, sort of crimson colored syrup that you can buy. That's all pomegranate molasses is. It's pomegranate juice that's slow reduced so that it doesn't burn, because it has a high sugar content. And it becomes a sweetener that has an extra element of tartness and a beautiful color for lacquering meats. There's a recipe in Sababa for sour lime chicken wings that are brushed with pomegranate molasses. I love the color and the flavor that they add. And it's very traditional in Muhammara to add pomegranate molasses, because it's from the countries where pomegranates are just prevalent and a major staple of the cooking in those countries. So I'm going to add about 2 tablespoons of pomegranate molasses. If you can't find pomegranate molasses, or if you can't find pomegranate molasses that's kosher for Passover, you can do a combination of honey and extra lime juice. I would say maybe 1.5 tablespoons of honey to an extra 0.5 tablespoon of lime juice, just to reinforce that flavor. And then limes. So in the United States, we take limes for granted. 100% of the limes that we're eating in America are imported from Mexico, and they come year round. But Israel is such a hyper seasonal cuisine that limes are seasonal, like most other fruits and vegetables. One of the things I love about Israel is you can't have an avocado anytime you want it, and therefore when you get it, you really treasure it, and it's a precious commodity that you enjoy. So if you come to Israel and ask for an avocado in your sandwich off season, you might get ejected from the restaurant, just warning you. My recipe does not call for using the zest, but in hindsight, I think it's always a good idea to add zest whenever possible. This lime smells incredible. A sign of a fresh lime that's local is that you can smell all of those amazing oils that are in the skin. And if you roll the lime a little bit to loosen the juice inside, you're going to get almost like an oily film on your hands. And nothing is better. It's kind of like a natural fragrance. All right, so I've now added some of the zest here, and I'm going to cut this lime in half, and I'm going to juice it into my muhammara. I've got a handy little lime juicer here. So I'm gonna, it calls for a tablespoon. I'm gonna go, I like things a little tart, so I'm gonna add a little bit more. I'm gonna add some salt. I'm gonna add some chili flakes here. About a quarter teaspoon. You could do less if you're sensitive to spice. And now I'm going to cover this. I'm gonna blend it. And at the same time, I'm going to drizzle olive oil in kind of slowly, sort of like in the same method that you would use if you were making mayonnaise. I mean, obviously we're not making mayonnaise here. We're making this beautiful red, chunky, nutty, amazing dip, but adding the oil slowly does help to emulsify the dip and make it creamy and give it a little more volume and make it fluffy. So I'm going to turn on the mixer, so it might be a little loud for a minute. Hang on. I'm sure somebody caught that the mixer was on backwards, I think. Ah, I'm not used to having it not straight in front of me, so hang on one second. There we go. Yeah. All right. I had it on the side so you could see it better. All right, so we're blending here. And I'm gonna take my oil and I'm gonna drizzle it in about 1/3 of a cup. And I'll know when it's ready when I sort of see it lightening in color and it's almost creamy, but it's still got some fluffiness to it. I might stop and scrape down the sides of the bowl a little bit because we've got a little bit of splatter action, but you know, you want it to look thick and spreadable. You know, if it's too thin and watery, you can definitely actually add it, put it in the fridge for a while because the nuts contain a lot of oil and all the ingredients as they chill down will solidify a little, but I'm gonna just blend this a little more. And I'm looking for a nice interplay of kind of nutty and sweet and tart from the pomegranate molasses and a little bit of spice from the chili flakes. I'm gonna just grab a spoon and give this a taste. Tastes great. I want a teeny bit more sweetness, so I'm gonna add just a drop more pomegranate molasses here. And I'm gonna blend it up, and I'm pretty sure that this is gonna be ready to go. And I'm gonna show you how I like to plate this beautiful dish. All right, our dip is done. I'm going to take another local beautiful plate. This one is from a potter called Now Pottery. And I'm gonna put it here. Let me see if I can move this a little bit so you guys can see a little bit better. There we go. Okay, and I'm gonna take the dip and I'm going to pour it straight onto my beautiful serving dish. And as you can see, I've chosen a dish that the blue dish is gonna contrast with the color of the muhammara dip and the green of the asparagus. So I'm gonna lay this down here and just spread it around very casually. Nothing too fancy, nothing too chefy here, guys. We're just home cooking for the holidays. You can also really, this is great on sandwiches, great with cold cuts, kind of great with everything. All right, and now I've got my asparagus, which I'm going to arrange it on top. I don't need it all to be in the same direction. I'm gonna do some of the tips one way, some of the tips the other way. It's kind of nice and bendy, but it's not lost its integrity or its spine, as I guess I might say. I'm just gonna sort of layer them on top here. And because I have it, I'm going to put a little bit of flaky sea salt on top here, just a drop. This is Malden salt. And of course, because it's still pomegranate season here, I'm gonna take some gorgeous pomegranates and I'm going to put those on top here. And as you can see, this is our beautiful, beautiful pomegranate muhammara asparagus. And you can take a little bit of olive oil if you want and drizzle it on the top just to finish it off. All right, guys, I'm gonna just sort of fake finish the stew and then show you what the stew is supposed to look like. So, and we're gonna pretend like our stew's been cooking for about an hour and a half. And now come our root vegetables. It's about 2 pounds of any root vegetables that you have. I used a combination of parsnips and celery root and carrots, and you can use beets. If you use beets, they tend to color. Could you make the stew in an Instant Pot? You absolutely could. It would definitely go faster. I think an Instant Pot is great for something where you're not trying to develop a ton of texture or crispiness. Like, why not? If you can do this in an hour instead of 2.5 hours, I say go for it. I make my chickpeas for hummus almost exclusively in an Instant Pot now, because not only is it faster, it's a no soak from 0 to 1 hour and 20 minutes to the silkiest, most skinless, most tender chickpeas that I've ever made. But I also just love the flavor because pressure cooking infuses flavor. So I put salt and bay leaf and garlic cloves in with the chickpeas and the water, a lot of salt, and it really seasons the chickpeas. All right, now our star ingredient here is our Medjool Dates. These are pitted. Israel is one of the main exporters of Medjool Dates. They're like nature's candy. They're fudgy. They have fiber. They're a great post or pre-exercise snack. They're grown in the Jordan Valley and in other areas of Israel. And they're wonderful. You don't have to pit them. You just have to be careful when you remove the stew. Sometimes people like to leave the pits in because it retains the integrity of the dates a little bit more. And you can also, obviously, if you don't have dates, you can use dried apricots or prunes. But I just really love the Israeliness of Medjool Dates and knowing that they were grown here in the country that I now call home. So I'm going to add a little more stock here. And then in theory, this would go back into the oven. You could cook it for another hour or so. And then I like to cook my stews uncovered for like the last half an hour or so, just because if I am serving it right away, it does help kind of develop like a nice brown top. So I'm going to pull out a stew magically from the oven that I have going here. It looks amazing. I have my foggy glasses, so you can all enjoy that for a second. And I realized that I forgot to add a thyme sprig to our recipe. But as you can see, I'm going to show you the pot, but I just basically put in an entire thyme sprig, kind of like what we know now as a bouquet garni, which is a bunch of spices that you would tie with a string and then remove at the end of cooking. But I'm just doing a thyme bouquet because it's easy. And I'm going to put the stew here. Lyra, can you come turn the camera right on the stew a little bit more so people can really see what it looks like? All right, guys. You can take it out, Lyra, now at this point. You can take the phone out and just literally hold it right over the stew so people can see. Amazing. So as you can see, Lyra, do a little scanning over the stew. You guys, here are our Medjool Dates. They're a little bit browned. We have a little caramelization. Here's our meat, which is fork tender and looks amazing. It's developed a wonderful rich sauce. There's just enough sauce to coat it. It's thick and wonderful. You can always add a little more stock if you need to cook it in the oven. I'm just going to show you how tender and beautiful the meat is. And there you have it. Somehow in the course of about 45 minutes, we managed to do 2 dishes. And I just want to thank Wizo for inviting me to do this. It gave me something to focus on during a challenging time here. I hope to see as many of you as possible in Israel soon. The skies are open and we're waiting for you to come visit in our homeland. And I wish you all a wonderful Passover and a meaningful coming few weeks.